I'm acting as director in Directorate E, that part of DG Connect in the European Commission, which is called Future Networks. And we look after a number of areas of activity. And my colleague from a sister directorate, who is a partner in this initiative, will present his directorate in a few moments. Because we're going to go very quickly through our policies with regard to building a European data economy. And the reason we're doing this now is it's not so much that we want to do a download or we want to do a memory dump on you, but it is that tomorrow, this is the taster for tomorrow afternoon, in which we have a much more detailed thematic workshop with, I hope, all of you to discuss the Data Economy Initiative. But what we thought we would do is, first of all, give you what work the European Commission is doing, where we are now, what our thoughts are very concretely in terms of the next steps, to feed that discussion where we, the Commission, we want to take a big step backwards in order to listen to you in that thematic workshop tomorrow. So this is part one. So I'm going to get straight into it, just by describing to you briefly where we are, and then we'll be doing a sort of a tag team approach in the next few minutes with regard to the slides, which are not visible anymore. So thank you very much. So, very quickly, putting it in context, a lot of what you've heard today and what is happening in the Digital Assembly is about the digital single market strategy, which is the core of our activities over the mandate of this Commission. And we have already done a number of, as I say, launched a number of initiatives. And one that is crucial was in relation to the data economy. In order to have a digital single market, you have to build on the data industry and make sure that the data market, the data economy, is fully functioning. Why? Well, let me just give you a little bit of context. Nothing that you don't know, and we could put up a lot more or different figures, and our colleague Giorgio from IDC has been one of the people who's been doing a lot of work for us in different aspects of the data economy and what it represents. But if we get this right, we can have a huge multiplier. Now, the European Commission doesn't for a minute think that the data economy is not going to grow without us. That is not actually what we are talking about. What we are talking about is what is now becoming a must-have for industry in any sector. Forget the ICT sector. Think of classical and traditional industries or new industries elsewhere. They are becoming more and more data reliant, or they are generating data which is also part of their or somebody else's business plan. But we want to make sure that we are maximizing the potential. And in fact, our figures show that there are differences between the minimum that will be achieved if we do nothing. But because of the obstacles, if we don't help to identify the problems, we will not get to this 740 billion figure with regard to growth in the European economy, which is real growth, jobs and innovation. That is the future of the European economy. That is one of the major motives for the action that we are taking. And then I will now click futilely. There we go. I've now gone too far ahead. Sorry about this. Let me just get down to the other framing statement. And this is one that is crucial for all of the discussion, and you must bear it in mind for tomorrow's thematic workshop as well. A lot of what we are talking about cannot be done effectively without the putting in place of a detailed personal data protection framework. The General Data Protection Regulation, which will enter into force next year, will ensure that we have a single set of rules and high-level protection of personal data across the European Union. Because as we have seen, as we will see from the public consultations, there is still a significant amount of lack of trust, lack of confidence in data technologies and services. And the main fear for consumers, as well as for businesses who have to handle personal data, is what is happening to my data. So with that framework in place, we will be able to actually create a single market which people buy into, where the trust and confidence is something which is no longer a key obstacle. So data protection is a key framing for the Data Economy Initiative. In fact, they are the foundation for a healthy EU data economy. Very specifically then, I'll just do that. As part of the steps towards concrete delivery of our DSM strategy, the Commission issued its policy document in January of this year, which was the communication on the data economy, looking at how can we actually fully unleash the potential in the European data economy, and looking at specific problems, drivers, and potential solutions, listing different options as to how we can treat them. So it outlined what the problems were and possible legal solutions. The main focus areas were, on one side, the free flow of data, problems related to localization or restrictions on the location and processing of data, and then a set of what we were calling then, but perhaps we need to modernize our technology, emerging issues. Issues regarding the access to data, the use and reuse of data, portability of data, and liability in relation to data and data technologies. We also talked in terms of data ownership in order to launch the debate. Again, something that will be dealt with later on. The most important thing then was that we set out policy options as to what could be alternatives for dealing with these issues, but more importantly, again, launching a major public consultation to get input from all parts of society and economy to those ideas. Do other people agree with our vision? And then what do they think about the various options that have been stated? We also had what we called structured dialogues with the member states to go into more detail as to how we might address with them some of the problems that were identified. And that led to, or fed into the midterm review. 2 years after the original digital single market, the Commission issued its review of the DSM, and we will talk about what that says a little bit later. But just then, talking about the public consultation, we had a number of contributions, 380 replies, and then outside of the formatted consultation online, over 100 other position papers, as well as many inputs from member states and from associations of industry and civil society. Now, most were from business organizations. Luckily this time, and this is not always the case with our consultations, over a quarter of respondents were SMEs, which is very important for us. So now, as I said, we will talk a little bit later about what is in the midterm review, what the Commission has said we now need to do. But before that, I would like to hand over to Giorgio Micheletti, who's going to tell us in more detail about the main results of studies that IDC have been doing on our behalf. Giorgio.
Thank you. Yeah, let's see if I can use. Okay. So thank you, Piers. Thank you, Eva, also for inviting me here. Yeah, very good introduction. And where are the slides? Thank you. So very good introduction. And I'd like to take a step back here a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, actually, in 2014, 2013, because yes, data economy, yes, digitization of the industry, etc. But the question that this study was trying and is trying to address is how big is this phenomenon? So it's nice to talk about this phenomenon, but we need to put some money behind this. So the European Commission came to us 3 years ago, and with a concept in mind. Let's see if okay. The concept that the European Commission had was, okay, we need to size this phenomenon and, oops, I'm sorry. And we have in mind a conceptual framework. The conceptual framework was called the Data Market Monitoring Tool. And we, so IDC together with Open Evidence, and I see some friendly faces here, hi Kasia, he's one of the contributors also to this study. So we put together our brains and said, okay, so how should this monitoring tool be? And we identified 6 main areas. I'm not going into the details and all the, the methodology behind this, etc. We don't have the time. That's the best excuse, but probably you're going to get bored. But the idea was to measure the phenomenon 3 times, so along 3 years, along these 6 main areas. So the number of data workers, the people who are actually employed in this data market and in this data economy, the number of data companies, who are they and how many are there in Europe, the revenues generated by these data companies, the concept of the data market. I'm going to spend a few words and end of the data economy. So how big is the data market and how big is the data economy? And also another indicator about the reliance of citizens on the data economy. So in other words, what are we as citizens doing with these data? But this was a bit more difficult to measure. A few words on the definition. Again, I don't want to bore you with the details, but when we talk data market and data economy, we're not talking the technologies per se. So the first thing here is big, where we see here at the top of big data. That's the technology. This is business. It's big data and analytics, for example. We're not talking how big, how much money is behind this, but we're talking how much money how much money is behind the data market, namely the market that is generated by the exchange of products and services made possible by data, and the data economy, which is the even bigger phenomenon. The data economy is what is the influence of this one, the data market, on the economy as a whole in terms of direct impact, namely the market itself, but also in terms of indirect impact, so the value chain. So what is it doing to the suppliers of the data companies who are active in the data market, and what is it doing to the clients, the customers of this economy, and also on the so-called induced impact. So what is doing on the consumption in general? Is it generating new jobs? Is it generating more money for all of us? So that's the big number, and the number that I think Piers was showing a few minutes ago. Now, a few words on the results per se. I'm not going to show, obviously, all the results. There's a thick report of 200 and some pages. So obviously, you can spend this weekend reading this report. But just a few numbers to give you an idea. So I said when I was showing the so-called monitoring tool that we measured the number of companies who are active in this market. This is the results that we came up with. So we're talking. As you can see, so from 2013 to 2016, we're talking 240,000 up to 250-something thousand companies. And the percentages that you see on the right-hand side here is the share of these companies, not on the total of the companies in the whole of the EU, but on two specific segments, because it was too easy to say, okay, the data companies as the total of the companies that are out there. There are 10 million companies in the EU28 at the moment, more or less, according to Eurostat. What we did was something a bit more meaningful. So it's okay, let's look at two specific sectors, which are the professional services and the ICT sectors. And among these sectors, well, let's look at how many companies are really data companies. And this is the percentages that we came up with, so from 13 to 14%. As you can see, they're not going to grow enormously because obviously we're talking companies here, organizations. Organizations are not created from one year to another at a big pace. The market is growing faster. The other numbers that I wanted to show you is precisely the so-called data market. So the market that is generated by the exchange of data-related products and services. So we looked this in 2013, 14, 15, 16. I'm just going to show you some the data for 2016 and our focus to 2020. So in what was 5 years, and now it's only 3 years ahead. So we said, okay. So we said in 2016 we came up with this number of 60 billion euros, EU28, including the UK, right? I don't know, maybe it's difficult to compare, but I mean this is big money. Right? It makes a difference, and I'll show you what the difference can be in terms of GDP just later on. And in order to estimate how big it's going to be in 2020, we designed 3 different scenarios. And this is, I'm connecting to what Piers was saying about the policies and the intervention, obviously, of policymakers and the European Commission in particular. So the baseline scenario is the neutral scenario, that which is characterized by, let's say, innovation is there is a relatively high and sustained growth, and there is a strong supply push. So the technology is there and the technology is pushing. And if this is the case, then the market is going to grow at more or less 7.5% compound annual growth rate, meaning so the growth rate in the next 4 years is going to be around 7.5%. This is huge because if we're taking, as IBC, we'll look at the IT spending, how much the ICT spending is growing in the next 5 years. It's not growing at this page. It's lower. It's lower. So that's a big result. But if there were an active push from a policymaker point of view, then we could come to what we call the high growth scenarios. And the high growth scenarios is where, the high growth scenario is where there's going to be a much, much higher growth rate. And everything is going to be sustained not only by normal, let's say, economic growth, but it's going to be sustained also by an active demand. So it's not only the technology that is pushing, but there are the users. We are the user, and we are going to actually pulling this. Obviously, we had to consider also a negative scenario where nothing is done and where innovation is playing a much reduced role. And in this case, interestingly enough, even if it's going to grow at a much slower pace, well, then it's still growing. So we're still talking big money, and it's still growing with respect to the number that we estimated for 2016. Few words, finally, for the other phenomenon that is even more important, which is the data economy. So what is the impact of this on the economy as a whole? If I can change. Same thing. We designed 3 different scenarios, a neutral scenarios that we call baseline, and a high growth scenario based on sustained economic growth, demand growth, but also on policy intervention, and the challenge scenario. In this case, you can see that the so-called data economy, so the wider phenomenon, already in 2016 is 300 billion. So we're talking a number that is at least 5 times bigger than the so-called data market. Namely, if we put the benefits of the data market at work, thanks to policy intervention and also other factors, then we could come to a much more, to a bigger number. This number represents more or less in 2016, depending on the numbers that we take, almost 2% of the EU 28 GDP. Now, 2% seems maybe not big, but it's actually, it's a quite important number. If we go to 2020, according to the baseline scenario, we come up to a number that is already 2.5% of GDP. If we look at the positive and more optimistic scenarios, we come to 4%. And if we look at the challenging scenario, still quite significant because 2.3%. Again, 4% is, in the positive scenario, is not a small number. The overall ICT industry in Europe, depending again on the sources, etc., is probably 2%, 1%, between 1 and 2%. So we're talking big money. So the European Commission was so happy about this study that I was not happy about it because yeah. So we're doing, in fact, what I wanted to show is that we're doing an update of this study, which just started. Actually, we sent the inception report to your colleagues a few days ago, 2-3 days ago. So we're going to do essentially the same exercise with some minor differences, and it's going to be for the next 3 months. And this time we're going to forecast more or less the same indicators, but up to 2025 rather than 2020. So stay tuned, and this is a website where you can look at the results and download the reports. Thank you very much, and Piers, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Giorgio.
Thank you.
So, moving swiftly along, but just to remind those of you who came a little bit late, or maybe even those of you who turned up on time and were shocked that we had started already, what we are doing in this session is trying to tell you exactly where we are in our work, in our analysis, in our policy preparation, and the proposals which the Commission is working on, so that tomorrow that will enrich the thematic workshop that is taking place in the afternoon, which I encourage you all to come to, which will allow a much more detailed discussion where the Commission, we will step back, we'll be sitting at the back of the room, and there will be a discussion among others. You, we hope, to really give feedback on this issue. So I'm now just going to concentrate briefly specifically on the data localization problem, which, as I said, was one of the two key themes in our data economy communication, the policy initiative launched in January, and which the Commission then came to some specific preliminary working conclusions in May. To start with, when we came to look specifically at the problem, we were actually surprised, given the feedback we had had in our original digital single market consultation, that we could only identify about 50 restrictions in primary law in the member states which actively localized data, prevented the location, the movement, or in some cases the processing of data outside of a national jurisdiction, or even in some cases a regional geographic jurisdiction. So those were primary law, administrative rules. But what we have discovered in deepening and going more profoundly into the situation and talking with the member states is that there are a number of uncertainties and even restrictions, for example, in particular in relation to public procurement practices, which have a profound effect on the localization of data, where in fact the governments and public administrations and local authorities as a purchaser of data services may actually have a significant impact on the data market. And this is why we are talking about an iceberg, as we use this as a hopefully useful metaphor, because underlying both of those issues is again even wider problem of a strong perception among those active in the market that they should or they must keep data, store data, and process data in that given geographical area, normally within the boundaries of a member state. And that, of course, is something which we must be realistic about. We can't legislate away perceptions, but we can certainly see if there is to be a measure with regard to transparency. But it is also linked, of course, to the perceived threat of regulatory scrutiny in the future. And to be considered to be uncooperative with a regulatory authority can actually significantly affect a company that wants to build its case, its reputation on being best in class with regard to compliance, both with regard to its customers as well as with regard to regulatory authorities. So this is why, as I said in my earlier brief presentation, that one of the things that we launched in January was these dialogues with member states to make sure that we fully understood the situations, that they understood what we were talking about, and that we collectively looked at the situation so that we could take the appropriate action. Now coming to our slides are gone again. I know I look very nice, but not really as interesting as the slides. So you didn't see my iceberg, but too bad. In terms now of our key analysis, it has become very clear to us, both in the studies that have been done for us by a number of consultants, in our own impact assessment, and of course in the responses to our various public consultations, that data localization requirements do in fact have a very real impact on the economy. They effectively are digital border controls. That is to say, they are the same barriers now in the digital era that the original single market policies in the past sought to address with regard to physical goods and services. They significantly inhibit businesses, particularly the development and growth of businesses, and we must think about SMEs. So those of you who've heard me speak before, I apologize, but I'm going to use the same example again. This is not about large ICT companies who have a global or even European footprint. Think about an SME that is trying to do business across just one border of the European Union. And because they, for example, are working in the area of financial services, or they provide taxation consultancy services, or they're working in the health domain, if they want to work in that second market, they have to localize the data arising from their customers or their services in that second market. For an SME, that means either investing in cloud services, which may not be part of their operational plan, or it means actually investing in their own IT equipment in that second market. For an SME, that can actually be prohibitive. That can actually mean that they do not have a business case if they want to compare their costs to a company located in that second market. That is the single market. That is the problem that we are seeking to address, and really we must focus on that. So we do talk a lot about cloud services, but we must think about the in-house data use and the way in which data is now part of services in so many sectors for companies large and small. Therefore, removing those restrictions, we see a number of benefits, of course, for users and for the providers of cloud services, but also for those businesses, and most importantly, so that they can run their applications as they wish in the safest environment that they design and is determined for their operations, at home, in another location. And that is the freedom to operate, which is crucial to the development of data technologies and services and their use by companies, once again, outside of the ICT sector. So it also means that there will be cheaper services available to the market, but also a menu of pick and choose cloud services where you might actually need a lot of your data to be stored with a relatively low level of security, but you might also decide that there are certain data sets that require a much higher investment. But you're not obliged to go for the local storage option, which in most cases will not be the cheapest. It will also have an environmental impact, and we must not forget this, in relation to the number and the efficiency of operation of IT equipment, cloud services, but also in-house IT equipment. And that is why we have analysed the potential gains if we intervene against data localization as being up to 8 billion euros per year for the European economy. Now, turning to another issue that we have identified, that is in relation to data portability. Because if we do establish the principle of free movement of data, if we remove data localization requirements, we also have to ensure that the business users and also, of course, consumers and private citizens can avail of that portability. And that is why we want to have a situation where data can be moved from service to service or even back home to own resources or own IT equipment on premises or elsewhere. And that is why it is so important for us to look at how we might achieve also data portability without interfering too much in the market. It has, of course, already been dealt with regard to personal data in relation to the General Data Protection Regulation. Again, I've said this is a key underpinning for anything we do in the data economy. But there is one gap even in relation to personal data. When a data controller, a company which has its personnel details, its customers' details, and other data relating, which is personal data, of course they must apply the rules of the General Data Protection Regulation. But if they want to move that data set, while protecting it, of course, from one of their service to another, from one cloud provider to another, from one country to another, they must also be able to port that non-personal data, and that is not covered by the General Data Protection Regulation. So we have to look at a number of scenarios. And it should be made easier, but also it should be more transparent. So these are issues which arose in the course of our consultation as being an added factor with regard to the freedom of the data market. So, in our public consultation, I told you what we had done in terms of launching it, the number of responses, but the feedback that we got, and we have already issued a short synthesis report. We'll be doing a much more extensive publication in July. And this really follows on from Giorgio's presentation as well, is that 63% of respondents did actually say that they had encountered data localization measures. And many of them said that it had high or medium impact on cost, but also on innovation. Again, 62% were in favor of removing data localization restrictions within the EU, and most of those preferred legislation as the type of action that would be required. However, and we must be very clear about this, there was a sizable group of respondents who also favoured soft measures, which would be guidance on data storage, increasing transparency on localization restrictions as well. And we must pay clear attention to that. Again, going back to the issue which I've already mentioned, but the responses that we got in the consultation was that it was clear that portability and portability services were needed. That was what the respondents to the consultation told us, including the ability to switch providers. However, at the moment it is clear that those services are not necessarily provided by services, and we do have, therefore, a problem of lock-in, which can be quite daunting for those who have to manage data. And a lot of cloud users would therefore would favor solutions that were standard compliant, so that they would know at least what standards apply with regard to APIs, interfaces, as well as to the formatting of data. And that will increase the possibilities, not just for exchange, but for data interoperability and planning within the company. So finally, for me, before we move on to the other important section of the Data Economy Initiative, in the midterm review, which I've spoken about in May, the Commission made a clear commitment with regard to the next steps, having had all of these inputs with regard to the preparation of our Data Economy Initiative. And that is that, subject to an impact assessment, and I can't stress that enough, that's an internal process, but one which will become very transparent, because we will show this to anybody if we make a proposal. We have to analyse what will be the impacts. Of course, the negative impacts as well of any proposed measure. But subject to that process, we will prepare a legislative proposal in the autumn on the free flow of data, on a cooperation mechanism to take account of concerns discussed with a number of stakeholders, including the member states. For example, where authorities who may previously have had a tendency to impose restrictions, for example, on tax data or company data, if they do actually need to have access to that data, because of course they do have regulatory obligations, they have a public policy reason for the tax authority to say, I want to see your data supporting this tax return. If that's stored in another country, of course, there needs to be a mechanism for them to have access to it, and rapidly. And the same applies across a number of other sectors. So that availability issue is one which will give greater confidence, in this case, to member states to actually implement the system. So that is where we are now. This is where tomorrow we hope to have a significant discussion with you, as I said, the Commission sitting in the back of the room, but with the moderators and with you in the audience, about what we say we think we can do, what you think we should do with regard to the free flow of data. And now I'm going to pass over to my colleague Ivo Vollmann, who's going to talk about all of the emerging issues which are equally important in the Commission's Data Economy Initiative.
Yes. Okay, good evening. Like George, I would like to take a little step back, or actually I would like to take a step back to the year 2000, when I started working on data. At that moment in time, data was a topic for geeks. In the meantime, that has changed. Tomorrow we have the biggest room in this digital assembly for the data issue. So data has become mainstream, and it's logical. Data is everywhere. What is nice about working in the area of data is that there are always things to discover, and things are changing all the time. And one of the new big topics is actually that a lot of data is generated by machines. For example, in production processes, in factories, in agriculture, smart tractors, sensors in the field, or by cars. And that data can actually be very useful also in other contexts. It can be used for different purposes in the same value chain, or perhaps even outside. But who actually has the right to access this data and to use this data? Now, at the moment, there is not a very clear and comprehensive policy framework for that question. And if you look at the practice, there is relatively limited access to the data I was describing. In many cases, it's actually the manufacturers who are de facto the owners of the data, even though there's no legal ownership. It's a situation of, I have it, you want it, hey, so we make a deal. And that leads to data silos, which is not good for innovation. A lot more could be done with the data actually than happens at the moment. Okay, well, on the basis of this analysis, the Commission made a catalog of possible solutions, and they go from relatively soft measures like guidance, promoting technical solutions to identify and exchange data, default contract rules, or perhaps model contracts, or, well, limiting the use of this data to a specific category of use, which would be public interest and scientific purposes. Those are the relatively soft measures, and then there's also the harder measures. Well, a data producer's right has been suggested as one way forward to give legal certainty to the people who invest in data. But others would say, well, why would you put a barrier around this data if you want to share it? That doesn't make too much sense. Another option that was treated in the communication that was published in January is the idea of access against remuneration. That sounds difficult, but basically it would be an obligation to share the data, but against remuneration. Now, we've done a public consultation, as Piers mentioned. And first of all, the question, is there actually an issue? Well, yes, there is an issue. 67% of the respondents said that wider data sharing should definitely be facilitated, right? So that's 2/3. But how should that be done? Well, there seems to be a strong support for soft measures, so promoting use of APIs, non-binding guidance, sharing best practice, that kind of measures. But there seems to also be a quite strong consensus coming out of this consultation that we shouldn't rock the boat too much. So the replies do not seem to be in favor of regulatory intervention at this moment in time, either by creating a data producer's right or by forcing people to open up their resources. So, what was announced in this midterm review, the DSM midterm review that was published on the 10th of May. So, we are going to continue to assess the need for action. What does that mean? It means the jury is still out about what we should do and what we can do in this area. Now, we are in the process of a range of workshops with stakeholders, and actually the workshop tomorrow is an important one also. We have a very interesting panel, so please all come to look at that. It brings together the political view and business experience with academic views, so that's going to be interesting. And then there's actually also a new strand announced in this midterm review of the Digital Single Market Strategy, which is about public data. So what does it say? The text that we're going to prepare an initiative on the accessibility and reuse of public and publicly funded data. Now, the basic idea there is that if things have been paid for by the public purse, they should be usable by anyone for commercial and non-commercial purposes. And actually there is a directive in place, directive on the reuse of public sector information, also called the PSI directive. And the Commission actually had an obligation to review this directive in July 2018, by July 2018. So obviously this is linked to this initiative. Then there's another side strand that we're going to further pursue, which is this issue of access to privately held data which are of public interest. Think of the case of statisticians that need data to do their work, or a case that was also mentioned in the plenary, epidemics, where you would need to combine actually public data and private data to give the most efficient response. So we are also going to further look into that issue. Now, from this summer onwards, and actually starting now, we are going to engage very actively with the member states, with all the stakeholders, in preparation for this initiative that's announced for spring 2018. And with that, I hand over again to Piers, who's going to...
Thank you. So, the last leg. We want to tell you just very briefly about one other thing which is in the list of issues that we need to deal with. That is liability. So again, I'm going to tell you, first of all, what did we say in January? It was that clearly with the development of new technologies, such as this family of technologies called Internet of Things, which is, what is it? Is it hardware, or is it data, or is it software, or is it all three, or a mixture of them? Well, everyone has an opinion, but more importantly, it is difficult to see how does that fit into and is dealt with by existing legislation on liability. The Product Liability Directive, which is already in place for some years, is what it says on the box. It's about products. But certain IoT services, an amalgamation of services in a complex chain of autonomous devices in itself becomes very difficult to follow. So it is that difficulty which we have to address. We have to look at the established concepts and principles to see if they need to be reworked or if they can actually provide a solution. Are they fit for purpose? So in the January communication, the Commission said that we would look at how to define responsibilities, for example, on a risk-generated approach or a risk management approach, and they were explained in some detail. And then looking also at potential voluntary insurance schemes to also be adapted to the IoT market. In response to that, in the public consultations, we did have some interesting feedback. That first of all, it is a concern for everybody, but again, there's this uncertainty. It's a fear of the unknown, or of perhaps in this case, simply the untested. And therefore, we already have some examples, but not a huge amount, of users, of companies that have actually experienced real problems with regard to responsibility or liability when it comes to IoT. And the majority of respondents favoured a risk management approach. That is to say that the entity, the person or company which has the best involvement in and capability to control the risk, it should in fact bear the brunt of liability. So as a result of that, in the midterm review, which we've been telling you about, and this is again launching the discussion for tomorrow's thematic workshop. This is what we are saying now that we should do or we should look at in regards to liability. And let me just say one thing. Our colleagues in another part of the Commission are currently doing a profound review of the Product Liability Directive. There has been already a consultation about that. So this work is going hand in hand. We have to analyze whether there is a need, specifically in regards to data technologies and services, to determine who is liable or in what circumstances one or other party would be liable. Taking the complex IoT case as an example in your mind, but there could be others which hopefully will be slightly simpler. But it is the fact that they are data intensive, that data, when generated by one system, could then be transported to another totally different system, and because it is erroneous, give rise to a fault, or even worse still, harm to a human. Or maybe because the software is not used to dealing with this type of data in the second system, that software causes an error, etc., etc. You can imagine the scenarios. However, that's the question that we now want to discuss with you tomorrow and ongoing. So I will say that at this point we are finished. I did this before, I'm doing it again, a shameless advertisement for our Net Futures conference in 2 weeks' time, in which we'll continue and have a detailed discussion on some of these issues. But now we are finished. We thought what we would do was that we would really test our luck with you, because you're all looking forward to the event. We technically have 2 minutes on the book, but we thought we might ask if anybody has questions or comments that they would like to make. Now, I would stress again that tomorrow's thematic workshop is the time where we would try to get you to go into details. But given that we have dumped a whole lot of information on you, given that this is the Commission presenting our thinking, maybe you had questions to any of us about issues. Yes, please.
Yeah, I have a question. Mari Lauristin, European Parliament Rapporteur on data privacy. Is there in Commission some, I don't know, persons, working groups, or somebody who is dealing with the concept of the data? Because we are in Parliament receiving from Commission different drafts, digital content contract, copyright, e-privacy, GDPR, where data, the word of data is used in absolutely different ways, with absolutely different content. In this sense, what you mean by data ownership, what you mean by data economy, what you mean by data intensive, and so on. So is there anybody who is dealing with the concept of the data?
Yes, we have a full division working on data policy, but I would answer you this way. Be careful for what you ask for, because you might get it. If you want the Commission to define data, I'm not sure, even working with the European Parliament, whether that would be the best solution. Where we have a clear legal definition is in relation to the most important category of data, and that is personal data. That is defined in a very clear regulation. We then have to define what is data that is not personal in the sense of anonymized data, and that will be done by the Data Protection Authority working with our colleagues under Mrs. Jourova. But in terms of us using contradictory terms or terms that appear to you in the Parliament or anywhere else that are not consistent, well, that actually goes with the territory. So I take your criticism, but if you ask us, is everyone dealing with it? Well, yes, we are regularly coordinated. This is a Commission initiative. We work very closely with our colleagues in DG Justice on this specific initiative, most importantly because of the importance of personal data, but also because of the very importance of contract law in dealing with many of the solutions that we're proposing. And there's a very important team in DG Justice who also deal with contract law, civil and commercial contract law. So that is only a partial answer to your question. But in fact, at the end of the day, if you want us to define what we're doing, then you're talking already about legislation or regulation, which we don't think is the answer for a lot of these things. It is, of course, when it comes to the crucial issues of who is responsible for something, but also what is the individual's rights. And that's when I say we go back to personal data. But part of the answer probably comes from the work that has been done on big data over a number of years. Ivo, would you have anything to add?
Yeah, one experience I would like to add is actually a discussion. I've been through a whole day with the member states. It's already a few years ago, about what was the meaning of data, what was the meaning of information, what was the meaning of knowledge, and what was the meaning of a document. It became a complete cacophony, and it didn't yield anything. It was really a lot of time wasted, because everyone came from their own background, their own legislation. So I appreciate very much the need to work on this, but I would also like to point out that this is a very difficult issue to get agreement on. And as Pierre said, perhaps you're not sure what you're wishing for. That's.
We will have to come back to that issue, but I would just say we have a very old piece of legislation, the Database Directive, for example, and in seeking to modernize the Database Directive, we again are encountered with the problems that you have talked about. There was a hand back here, first of all.
I have the mic, if I may.
Oh, sorry. Okay, who has the mic? That's power. Yes?
Thank you. Jakob Grenner from Deutsche Telekom. I just have a question on your slide in regard to the free flow of data. I believe you pointed out that as a preliminary result from the consultation, there's a considerable amount of respondents saying that they would prefer soft law in terms of guidelines.
But a minority. The majority of respondents favored legislation.
Okay, but I think you said you somehow want to take this into account,
yes.
Or it's a challenge. I'm just asking how you think this can be put into account, given that the Commission is already intending to propose a legislative proposal. Thank you.
Yes, because of course a legislative proposal would, because you're used to the Commission and therefore maybe you have bruises from the past, would always assume prescriptive and detailed regulation. It doesn't necessarily have to be that. For example, in some of these data areas, we are definitely looking at how do we create a process to ensure that there is standardization, or how do we create certification? We don't get involved in standardization. The standards are there. The problem for the user, for the citizen, and for small businesses is there are so many standards. How do we allow them to recognize that that standard or this system actually takes account of my needs for security of data, or so that I can respect my obligations under GDPR? So that kind of support in the free flow, we think we need to have a clear transparency mechanism. That's not the sort of prescription that you might imagine. We need to have a notification mechanism. That already exists in European law, the Services Directive, the Transparency Directive on internal market technical measures. So if we just have a legal principle on free flow, for example, that will then become, we can then use the existing mechanisms of notification of technical measures, where a member state really feels it still has to introduce a localization restriction. So we don't add to the burden that already exists. We make sure that we keep the administrative burden low. So that is why, while being part of a legislative framework, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to have detailed prescriptive regulation controlling governments or controlling economic actors. I don't know who was quickest, but you were both there. That's the hand. I saw this, you, certain gentleman, you were definitely asking earlier.
Thank you. My question is, have you looked at the consequences of the new data economy for business models and arising, like, how can we better support startups, SMEs that base their business on the new data economy, and how can you better enhance access to finance for the sector?
Well, already you saw some of the elements of our analysis in what Giorgio presented to you, but of course we've already been looking at, we've had a big data policy in place now for a number of years. Ivo?
Yeah, let me give one element. I think that one element is basically the availability of a pool of data that can be used by SMEs to innovate and to start business with. That's why this initiative on public sector information is so incredibly important. Basically to make sure that there are data available that can be used in this context. The availability of finance, that is being looked at in Horizon 2020 context. That actually was not the case before. So that has been considerably strengthened in the new framework program for research and development.
If I could add to that, clearly one of the reasons why the Commission very deliberately raised concepts as challenging and perhaps controversial as data ownership, as alongside the discussion about access and reuse of data, was actually because we do feel that there are significant ideas and potential out there for whole new sectors, whole new growth areas for the European economy, which will bring growth and innovation and employment in the future, which we must explore. We must allow that to breathe. We aren't going to be the ones inventing that. We have to help others to create the space for that to grow. So that is why we are pushing this even further than some of the, what I would call established industrial respondents would definitely not like us to go, so that we can have that discussion to make sure that our startup policy in this area, the data economy, is actually looking at what could be very important for Europe in the future. So we have another one here, and then this gentleman, please.
I've noticed that recent proposed directive introduced the new concept of paying with data. I'm thinking at the proposed directive setting out the new rules for business to consumer contract for the supply of digital content. In this directive, there is this interesting concept of actually paying with data. And being an economist, this is something really interesting to me, which has a lot of consequences. And I was wondering if you examined that aspect of paying with data.
Do you? Sorry, Ivo's getting all the difficult questions, thankfully.
Yeah, I take the difficult. This is not really my area, but what I see out there is that there's different groups where actually there are some people who are tech savvy and who actually could manage their data and have transactions like paying with your data. So they would make their data available for any kinds of reuse, and they would get, when they want, they could get some remuneration. On the other hand, there's people, well, who are not so tech savvy, and actually there could be abuse in that kind of situations. And then there's the whole group in between. I'm one of the persons who always, well, click away very easily these consent, how you call them, I agree.
Yeah, but what we have to be clear about is that when you say it's a directive, when the Commission is launching ideas, we've had this discussion. We are already clear, and again, just to go back to what I was saying about constant discussion with the various parts of the Commission to make sure that we're being coherent, there is significant preoccupation about paying with personal data. Now, of course, you would assume that it's your personal data, so just as you want it to be protected, you should also have the right to decide as to what happens with it. But however, those business models might be traps in themselves. There could be difficulties downstream with regard to what happens to that data eventually. So it's something which has been discussed, but again, which has to be discussed in much greater detail. But it is one of the models with regard to a data economy, and so again, something that we want to have further discussions with stakeholders on. Now, I have one gentleman already asked for the floor, and I'm really now abusing on your time. So I'm going to say the following. We're going to keep going for another 5 minutes, even though you should ideally be walking to the reception now. But we're very happy to continue with those of you who want to stay, and we don't take it at all personally if some of you feel it's time to leave. But it's really great. Please continue and come back tomorrow at 1:30 for the detailed workshop. Please.
I have a quick question for Giorgio. So what you presented are sort of absolute possible speeds, like these 3 scenarios for Europe, right? Now, did you explore also relative speed of Europe compared to the rest of the world, right? And on the other side, do you analyze the possible speeds within the Europe across the states, right? So this would be interesting view as well. Relative speed to the rest of the world is definitely relevant, right?
So, yep. Yes and no, in the sense that when it comes to the rest of the world, we identified, there were discussions with the European Commission, and we identified 3 countries outside Europe. One was Brazil, representing the emerging markets, but within the, let's say, the Western world. Then one was Japan, so the Asian market, and one was the United States, obviously. So we took these countries into consideration. We measured the same indicators. We measured the indicators also to the year 2020, but we did not go into the exercise of the 3 different scenarios. Why? Because that would have entailed access to data and the knowledge that we didn't have, to be very honest with you. So obviously that was not. So yes to the second part of the question, because the study, I just presented some of the final results, but these results are split by member state. So yes, you can go and see that Estonia in 2020, according to the high growth scenario, is doing this, and Luxembourg is doing that according to the challenge scenario. So you can go.
So let me add that, of course, our slides will all be available on the Digital Assembly website, and of course on that then you have links to the study so that you can get more information. This gentleman here was, yep.
Hello, Paul Munt from Adaptive Solutions. I was just wondering, so touching back on this earlier point about paying with personal data. I think one of the things that was interesting previously was this discussion about the different constitutional rights about privacy and oversharing and these sorts of things. That just because you agree to something and you share something on social media does not necessarily mean that you should then be stripped of those constitutional rights. And these are things that, of course, vary considerably across the different member states. And I think this is something that has not been really harmonized or touched upon well within the GDPR, but will come through when there is the implementation at the member state level. The other thing that I think was quite interesting is this issue of informed consent. Mm-hmm. If you have people that read through 2 or 3 paragraphs of legalese and click I agreed, could you really argue that they've been informed or not? Mm-hmm. Often people click through these things without reading them, so is there actually a burden of them or for the service provider to determine the level of information? So I think one of the key issues to figure out going forward is, will there be legislation that pushes back against the monetization of personal data? What sort of safeguards we put into place to make sure that people do not simply give their data away because they think it's worthwhile for the service, and that the companies that actually do want to use the data know that what they can do from a consent point of view, that it's legal to do so, and under which kinds of terms and restrictions they're allowed to use that data.
Well, I'll start with the question in your question, which is, will there be legislation? I don't know. That is to say, we are not at that point. And in fact, it has not been a core part of what we are now presenting to you today. But it is very important to state, once again, that in relation to the General Data Protection Regulation, that sets some very strong rules to protect that data, to the extent, and this is actually one of the surprising things about the regulation, is that there could be doubts placed on whether the individual has the ability to actually let that data go, in the sense that the company might want it. Because whatever they put in those 5 pages of thinly typed conditions, it might be that the individual cannot actually abrogate their own rights to that data. So if I agree that in order to access this service, you may have my data, but many of the processes or the uses that that company may wish to make of the data, they may not be allowed to do so, in which case the document is invalid irrespective of who signs it, and therefore it has no value to the company, so they shouldn't pursue that. So that's actually a sign of the strength of the data protection regulation, but it also means that we do have to have this discussion. You mentioned constitutional rights. The main point of the GDPR was we have a directive, it's being applied with too many variations. And one of the big ones is what you've just said about informed consent. The extent of differentiation, this was the primary analysis of the Commission before we proposed the GDPR, was that you had completely opposite situations between explicit, detailed consent down to presumed consent unless the person had actively said no. And of course that is not acceptable if you want to have a high level of protection. So the issues such as monetizing data, as it's called, or paying with your data, we would have to now look at what we know is, now it is the bedrock of our data economy, the GDPR. Now I'm going to take one more question this gentleman has been asking, and then I think I should let you all go. Please.
Thank you. Yeah, just a quick introduction. I'm Dimi from Wikimedia, and we are developing since a few years in Berlin a project called Wikidata, which is, we also do Wikipedia. So Wikidata, the idea is basically gather all of the world's knowledge as structured human and machine readable data. It's free, reusable for commercial purposes. So in 5 years, if basically anybody is looking for a big pool of data, that will be the go-to resource, just like Wikipedia is now for encyclopedic data. Now, in our mind, the way...
You're going to ask a question.
Yes, sorry. You say free flow of data is the most important, the thing that will mostly boost GDP growth. We believe the same thing. And still this data ownership right gets mentioned on the slides. How exactly, you must have discussed this since you still have it on the slides, how exactly will a potential data ownership improve the sharing of data and the free flow of data? This is something that I logically fail to understand. Thank you.
I think the basic idea is quite simple. By giving certainty to someone who's investing in data that actually he or she is the owner, you would give an incentive to share it. Because at the moment, there is no ownership to data. So basically, if you give it out, legally speaking, anyone who gets their hands on the data can use it. And there's no way of suing these people because there is no rights to the data. So that is the basic idea. I take your point. There are a number of minuses also linked to this proposal, but well, the basic idea is not that stupid, I would say.
Well, the Commission has often been responsible for, guilty of, making proposals which have not seen the light of day at the end. And certainly what this has done, it has helped to have a much more focused discussion on all of these data issues, including access to data. Now, I would like to thank you all for your loyalty, perseverance, and your energy. Thank you very much. But as I say one last time, tomorrow afternoon, 1:30, there was the session in which we will stop talking and listen, and you will do all of the talking with the panel of outside experts. So thank you very much. Have a great evening, and see you tomorrow.